I left Indianapolis in December of 1991 and moved to Bloomington during Indiana University's winter break. I'd recently withdrawn from classes at the Indianapolis campus and had told my parents that I was going to enroll in classes in Bloomington. It would be almost 2 years before I finally enrolled, and another 2 years before I eventually finished college. During that 5-year window, I had the opportunity to take in a huge number of shows. Many of them were house shows in living rooms and basements. Others were street dances set up outside the public library or various other locations downtown. But the vast majority of those shows were at Second Story. I had the opportunity to sit down with Bird Burdishaw, who has written 2 volumes of memoir about his recollections of Bloomington, including much of its music scene. Volume 1 is titled All the Best Stories Start with a Bad Decision. Volume 2 is titled I Opened My Mouth to Vomit, But All I Got Were Words. Bird shares his recollections around Second Story here.
I've already talked briefly about the 1980 DOA show at Bullwinkle's. It was actually the seed that would take root and grow the premier space for Bloomington's alternative and artistic collective in the 2 decades to follow. The importance and influence of this nightclub cannot be understated, and I will not do justice to it in the following pages. Here goes anyway. First, one could not talk about Second Story without at least touching on how it came to be. The birth of the place had unarguably auspicious beginnings, because you can't get better underground bohemian bona fides than being the product of a gay nightclub in Indiana. The space that would be Second Story sat atop a local gay hotspot called Bullwinkle's. Bullwinkle's had only been open for a few years before Second Story came into existence, but it was already wildly successful. That nightclub started in the late 70s when a guy named Phil Rhodes opened up the space in a building that had once been home to the local Moose Lodge, aka Loyal Order of Moose Hall. Phil used the Moose moniker and named the place Bullwinkle's, after a cartoon from the 1960s called The Rocky and Bullwinkle Show. The place grew almost instantly into a popular night spot for Bloomington's gay populace, taking the place of secret meeting spots, one-off house parties, and underground hookup areas around town. At last, Bloomington's gay population, which was reputed to be on par size-wise, percentage-wise, with New York and San Francisco, per capita population, of course, now had a safe place to go and express themselves openly. They could dance and drink and socialize without the fear of judgment, harassment, or violence. They had a dance floor that rivaled, even surpassed anything Bloomington had to offer at the time, and a hassle-free atmosphere that was immediately attractive to hetero women who wanted to go somewhere and dance without being fondled and catcalled by frat boys, jerks, or redneck assholes. They had drag shows and held Miss Gay Indiana pageants. The nightclub grew and prospered fairly quick. The building that housed Bullwinkle's had a second floor that mostly sat empty. The space was long and wide, and as time went by, it would be utilized by Bullwinkle's for drag shows that happened every once in a while. That way, the bar downstairs could still operate as a disco, and the overflow crowd that was there for the drag show could watch and drink upstairs and then come down later and join the dancing that was still raging on. It was a great way to maximize space and throng, and more importantly, the dollars that came with it. Mostly, though, that upstairs hall just sat there, dark and empty. In 1980, a guy named Bob, who was the founder of an early Bloomington record label called Gulcher Records, asked the owner Phil if he could put on a punk rock show. That show, the aforementioned DOA gig, lit the fuse. Shortly after, a local cable radio DJ from QAX named Gary convinced Phil that regular shows in that space could earn more money for Bullwinkle's. Phil gave the okay, and Gary started booking shows in the space. I do not know what those shows were, who was there, or how successful it was. I do know that they happened under the Bullwinkle's moniker, that when they started losing money, Phil put the kibosh on them. Genie was out of the bottle, though. Other people saw the unused potential, and with enough prodding and encouragement, Phil opened the space again in 1981 under its own name as Second Story. The club would be its own entity and would win or lose under its own steam. Any losses of revenue wouldn't affect Bullwinkle's. One of the guys who was responsible for the club opening would book shows for the first year of its existence and then off and on over the course of its life. His name was Lee, and I've mentioned him before. He's the driving force behind the Lotus Musical Festival in Bloomington, Indiana.
I had the opportunity to speak with Gary X Indiana recently, and during that conversation, he was able to share with me some of his recollections of those early days at Second Story.
WQAX.
QAX was kind of pretty instrumental in a lot of the local music.
Remarkably, since it was cable, that's some of those guys were in the original version of the Gizmos. We did street dances. The street dances were I guess the big thing. It was mainly just sort of a petri dish for local music buffs. I started at Quacks and at the beginning of the 78, thus the DJ name. I added the X in the middle. Beginning of 1980, I'd kind of caught on into what was going on. Culture Bob did a show. The place was Bullwinkle's. It was the old Moose Law, and Bullwinkle's was a gay club, and you walked in, you went downstairs a few steps, they had a disco and stuff, and upstairs they did drag shows. So I did a deal with the owner and started booking shows there in 1980, and then bands like maybe Dow Jones, Mars Needs Women, and wanted to have this new wave band from Chicago for some reason at Bullwinkle's. That was a total flop, and the owner lost $1,000 or so. I don't know what it was, and we actually had a fist fight.
Punks, new wave kids, drag queens, and other attendees were frequently subjected to drive-by harassment by the locals. The concert booking arrangement between Indiana and Rhodes was canceled after a money-losing concert by a Chicago new wave band. Second Story was then born from an idea shared by two former Bullwinkle's DJs, Mike Dommermuth and Lee Williams. The name came from Phil Rhodes, who helped get the project off its feet in 1981. Williams handled the booking for the first year until he handed the position over to Jazz Fables founder David Miller and Denise Self. He returned the booking position in 1993, but left again in 1999. Second Story closed its doors in 2003, although it continued to host the drag shows with Bullwinkle's. At the prodding of the original founder, Lee Williams, it reopened its doors in February of 2004 with a new booker, Mark Cheetah, who had previously booked for a local club called Vertigo. I recently reached out through social media and asked folks to submit their recollections of Second Story. I'd like to share with you some of those audio recordings that people have submitted to me. Local musician Heather Craig shares her recollections now.
Some of my favorite memories regarding Second Story, the late great music and performance venue here in Bloomington, Indiana, were just centered around some of the groups that came together that probably couldn't have played anywhere else. Denise Self would allow a lot of experimentation, a lot of creativity to enter that club and give people a chance to express themselves. Sometimes some of these groups were a one-time only, one-off kind of supergroup or experiment. Sometimes they lasted for a year, a couple years, or even longer. A lot of times performances involved just interesting stage props, costumes, design, instrumentation, just a whole lot of freedom and a space where it was safe to be free to create. One of the some of the stage props that come to mind were a giant cardboard box painted to look like a semi-cab that was used in a performance by Crew Cab Dooley, who I was was Rob Houle and John Diener and others in that band, and involves some CB chat, just some interesting additions to their musical show. Of course, everybody remembers the Plastic Cheeses and their crucifix that was a spurted fake blood, I believe. It looked like it was made out of cheese. My roommate Laura Williams was in a band named Big Lick Child, and they had some. Oh gosh, it was like I think if I remember, was made to look like a man it was a mechanized torso that somehow was stabbing itself with a knife, and there were more. We would have very funny. It was a very personal local club in a lot of ways. There were inside jokes with the bands and their audiences, fun surprises, performers would include just really interesting, maybe not necessarily inside jokes, but things that were shared between the friends. There was a friendship between the audience and the musicians and performers in so many ways. It was a very, very special time here in Bloomington, and very important part of my musical career, and just my time getting to see other performers, national and local. I really treasure Second Story, and I really appreciated all of Denise Self's help and support of the musical projects that I was involved in. Second Story became a stage where I grew musically. I think my very first performance with a band in Bloomington out in public was at Second Story, sitting in with John Diener and the Good Eggs for a live from Bloomington performance. And that might have been 88, around there, maybe 88, 89. John might correct me later. I ended up playing in a band called Auritas Auritis, which was Terry Turley, Cletus Slamping, Joy Bridie, Roger Peabody, William Bass, Joe Donnelly. We had several other people who came in and out of that group at different times, percussionists and other musicians. And that was really fun. We had several of the members wrote songs and participated in creating the music for that. We had a blast, and that was a really good time. And it's just getting my feet wet and improvising and playing in bands at that time. Also sat in with a local group, Fingers and Sunshine, the McKibben brothers. Later down the road in my career, which became more professional, I played with the Mary Janes several times there. That was Janice Hoyt's group, the Mary Janes. It had various members in various incarnations. That you should probably interview Janice and ask her about all that. I remember the previous band I was speaking of, the Auritas Auritis. We would open up for the Chicago-based band, the Drovers, Irish rock band. Denise would book us with them fairly regularly. I remember getting on stage in an altered state and playing their encore last song, Sympathy for the Devil, on Sean's electric violin. He played around with the pedals. That was very interesting. I don't know how good it sounded, but it was very fun. The Second Story stage became a really comfortable place to build my foundation musically, to get it was a good place to have a firmly planted, growing career. I'm sure I played there with other bands, possibly the Scythians, which was a short-lived group back in the 90s, I guess it would have been, late 80s, early 90s. I really feel that a lot of musicians probably built their careers and got their chops strengthened and their stage presence honed a little bit there at Second Story, and it was a much appreciated place to do that.
My friend from college, Matt Schaefer, recalls one of the most memorable experiences he had at Second Story now.
To be honest, I haven't thought about Second Story in many, many years. My time in Bloomington was from 1988 until 1993, and I turned 21 in 1991. So that very early part of the 90s, Second Story was often part of the weekend routine. There weren't a lot of places in Bloomington, I don't know if there are now, but certainly back then, to go see live original music. There were just really 3 venues in town outside of people's basements and backyards, and then of course the big mega shows at the university. There was Jake's, and then there was the Bluebird and Second Story, if I remember right. And there was an all-ages venue called Rhinos where most of the hardcore bands played. But my perception of Second Story may be way off at this time, but I remember it being kind of just a little bit nicer than the other venues, that the bands were perhaps a little bit more experimental, perhaps a little bit more funk, perhaps a little bit more jazz, perhaps a little bit more country than the regular alternative or punk bands that were over at Jake and the Bluebird. That being said, some of my most favorite bands from Indianapolis played there a lot too, and I'm from Indianapolis, and I remember a Grey Zero Boys set there and seeing Modern Vending. So yeah, it was very much a great experience for us when we were 21. I think the most best show that I saw at Second Story was, I think in 1991, was the Jesus Lizard, and it was packed, and it was an incredibly good time. My most vivid memory there was at the beginning of the show. I don't remember the stage at Second Story being very high, maybe about up to one's knees, maybe even a little bit lower. And there was just a wall of people in front of this stage, maybe 10 people deep. And Dave Yao and the Jesus Lizard started going, and almost immediately Yao just charged the whole, the wall of people up front and threw some crazy cross-body check into everybody up front and bounced off everybody and onto the stage and got up and repeated the process several times without regard to who was standing in front of him, and no matter how big or small they were, whether it was, a male or a female in front of him, he just violently went at it trying to, I don't know what he was trying to do, but it was just out of control, and the music was out of control. And eventually, as he continued to smash himself into the wall of people, he sort of ended up halfway up on top of people's heads and arms, in some sort of crowd surfing almost thing, and was chucked back on the stage again. And he went headfirst into the corner of one of the monitors so hard, I remember it kind of actually scared me. I mean, his head bounced off that monitor, and he laid there for a few seconds and got up just staggering, and there was a little bit of blood running down his face, and picked up the microphone and just continued right where he left off, as hard as and intense as he ever was. I don't know if I'll ever forget that. It was pretty intense scene and a great show.
Jody Crummell recalls booking a show at Second Story one time.
I was working for Earwax Records for JR, who owned the business, and someone had reached out about booking the Kaisers. I think it was No Hit, the label, and he said sure, but he'd never booked a show before. So he talked to me about it. I got Jonathan Knoll on board, and I believe it was the Cuban Jerks that ended up opening for that show, and we promoted the hell out of it. And the Kaisers came into town. They were from Scotland. We hung out for the day, had a cookout, delightful people. A couple of their girlfriends were with them. They were terrified of the lightning bugs. So I believe it was probably summer then, now that I'm thinking about that kind of connection. Terrified of the lightning bugs because they'd never seen them in Scotland before. The Kaisers were this beat band from Scotland, kind of little, I call them like a punk rock Beatles, and they were absolutely phenomenal. And they had their own vintage PA that they had brought with them. And I don't think anybody really knew that at the time. I feel like the audio guy, like sound guy at Second Story, might have been a little miffed about it. But they got it all set up. It sounded great. I don't think it was a sold-out show. It was packed. They ended up recording it and released it as an album, Twist with the Kaisers, in 1999. I have that on vinyl and CD, so you can, I'm pretty sure I can hear myself in the crowd screaming. I was so excited. It was just such a fun day. Jonathan Knoll introduced them, so whenever I listen to that record, I can hear his voice, and they were just so stoked to open up for them, too. I'll have to ask them about that. I think I still have my Cuban Jerk shirt, and I still have my Kaiser shirt from that tour. I'm pretty sure that's either the band, whatever Jonathan Knoll's band was at that time, that's the band that opened up. And we just had a blast, and so did they. One of the many, many fun nights at Second Story. Second Story would let restaurant workers in after midnight for free. They're for what were at the time was a $3 cover. I can't even imagine what bands were getting paid at that time. But hey, $3 was $3 back in the day for me. And I saw a lot of music that I would have never have seen just because we got done with work. We could get in for free, and if the show sucked, we'd leave. If the show was great, we would stay. Lots and lots of fun memories that way. And John the bartender would always have my beer open before I could even get up to the counter because I pretty much only drank the same thing throughout the night. Nothing like a good bartender that knows your drink and has it ready waiting for you at the bar. So sad to know that place is no longer there, but such great memories. What a great club.
Kevin Loyal of the Walking Ruins recounted his memories of Second Story in a recent episode.
And in the early days of Second Story, you got 50 people in. That was fine. Mm-hmm. By the early 90s, we could, good night, 200 people at Second Story because everyone was going to Second Story. So we played there. We'd always try to, throw in a house party or two.
Deke Hager talked about the time his band, Chibadawa, was banned from playing at Second Story.
And so we played our first set and it went very well. And we kind of got a buzz, and then we played a show at Second Story not too long after that. And when we played that show, this friend of ours, Freddie Dempsey, who was a kind of a one-eyed, one-lunged, homeless pirate Vietnam vet guy, just kind of abrasive and scary to a lot of people, but just this really ultimately a very kind and beautiful soul, and one of really only a few permanent full-time homeless people in Bloomington at the time. Was a friend of ours. I knew him from working for Bird, plus he was friends with all the punk rock people, and sometimes he would sleep on the couch at the House of Raging Women after parties, and they were fine with that. He was at that show, and we had built a little pylon of TV sets that had been dumpstered, and he got up and smashed one of them on the dance floor, getting us barred from Second Story for about 3 years, and also sort of cementing our reputation as a sort of a chaotic, whatever can happen will happen band.
Over the 25 years or so that Second Story existed, it became home to Bloomington's local music scene. Many folks still tell stories of the shows they saw there, the bands that they grew to love, and the music that became the soundtrack to their time here in Bloomington, Indiana. Second Story is still missed today.